Welcome to Justice Matters. I'm Denise George, Attorney General of the U.S. Virgin Islands. Justice Matters is a program aimed to inform, engage, and empower you with knowledge of Virgin Islands laws that affect our everyday lives and our entire community. We have insightful discussions with special guests on the laws and related topics so you can be empowered with knowledge about the issues and take action so you can make a difference in our community. For today's topic, we're talking about the fight against domestic violence crimes. Joining us on Justice Matters is Jeanette Jean Baptiste of the Virgin Islands Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Council, or what we call DVSAC. That's the group that is dedicated to ending domestic violence and sexual assault in the U.S. Virgin Islands. But first, how does Virgin Islands law define domestic violence? What makes a crime a domestic violence crime is that there is a relationship between the offender and the victim. Our laws define domestic violence as the occurrence of any violent crime or offense, attempts or threats against a person who may be a spouse, former spouse, parent, child, or any other person related by blood or marriage, a present or former household member, a person with whom the victim has a child in common, or a person who is or has been in a sexual or otherwise intimate relationship with the victim. Those crimes and offenses include assault, battery, burglary, kidnapping, unlawful sexual contact, rape, forcible or unlawful entry, coercion, harassment, threats, false imprisonment or stalking, violation of a restraining order. The law requires that every crime charged that is also an act of domestic violence must state that it is a crime of domestic violence on the charging documents or other court documents filed by the Attorney General prosecutors. It has to label a crime a domestic violence crime, but labeling it as a domestic violence crime does not have any impact necessarily on the seriousness of the crime, but it calls into play certain special legal remedies for prosecution of domestic violence for victims because of the relationship that exists. For instance, VI law affords emergency relief to protect victims of domestic violence through restraining orders against the offender. A restraining order, also called a domestic violence restraining order or DVRO, is a civil court order that is designed to stop violent behavior and keep the abuser away from the victim. There are two types of restraining orders in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and that is an ex parte temporary restraining order, also called a TRO, and a permanent restraining order, both of which are designed to provide a victim of domestic violence with immediate protection from the abuser. A judge may issue a temporary restraining order on the day that it's filed in an emergency basis, and judges often do so upon the arrest of the offender. A temporary restraining order will protect you from the time you file until your full court hearing takes place, usually within 10 days, at which time a permanent restraining order may be issued, which lasts up to 2 years, depending on the facts and circumstances of each case. Also, VI law requires that in domestic violence arrests, that the offender cannot be released until appearing before the court for an initial hearing. This is often called a quote-unquote cooling off period for the protection and safety of the victims of domestic violence. Yet, apart from our laws and the court system, a significant part of the fight against domestic violence rests in members of our community, from victim advocates to concerned citizens, bringing awareness and protections to victims in our community. Joining us now is Jeanette Jean Baptiste, a community outreach specialist from the Virgin Islands Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Council, DVSAC. DVSAC was formed by by founding members on each island of St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John in 1997 to address oppression and systems of advocacy for domestic violence victims. In about 2013, DVSAC reportedly became an independent organization and is recognized as the State Territorial Coalition by the National Office on Violence Against Women and the Department of Health and Human Services. Well, welcome to Justice Matters, Ms. Jean Baptiste.
Good
I think you
morning.
asked me to call you Jeanette. So
Yes.
You did ask me that. So
Yes.
Jeanette, welcome. Tell us what DVSAC does.
Well, DVSAC's motto is to prevent domestic violence and sexual assault through prevention education. We are not service providers, so if you have a problem, you don't come to us. The service providers are on St. Thomas Family Resource Center and St. John, and on St. Croix it's Women's Coalition.
And they provide the services directly to the victims.
Yes, they do.
So with DVSAC, what is your role in that?
I am an outreach specialist. That means that I go around and I talk, and I talk a lot. I talk about different topics. If anybody wants me to talk about a certain topic, I do that.
Well, I'm looking at the mission, and it's stated on the website of DVSAC. The mission of DVSAC is to coordinate prevention and response efforts in order to reduce the incidence of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and dating violence, and to make these crimes socially and culturally unacceptable in the United States Virgin Islands. What is domestic violence?
Domestic violence happens in a home. So it would be any form of violence, any form of abusive behavior between members of a family. For example, parents and kids, parents, husband and wife, kids and kids. All of that would entail domestic violence.
What would you say is the unique factor about domestic violence that makes it different than even other issues?
It is hidden. It's like a hidden crime because the majority of victims, survivors do not report it.
And why is that?
Because sometimes they're ashamed. Sometimes they love the person and they always think that the person will change. Sometimes they're scared because they've been threatened. If you tell anybody, this is what I'll do, I'll take the children, things like that. And so they are afraid to go to the police and report it. Or sometimes they report it and nothing's done. No charges are brought forth. So they're like, what's the point?
And sometimes, let's say when there are charges brought forth, that there's some kind of, reaction from law enforcement. Are there any ways that they can be protected, their safety can be protected? Because as you indicate, sometimes it's because of fear that they don't report. So are there ways that the victims can be protected?
They can go to the shelter through Family Resource Center. If they call the cops and they indicate that they don't want to go back to the house, the cops will call Family Resource Center or Women's Coalition and make arrangements for them to be taken care of by the agency.
So that is the Family Resource Center you referred to on St. Thomas, St. John district, right?
Yes.
And then there's the Women's Coalition on St. Croix.
Yes.
District, right?
Yes.
And so they can take them to a shelter.
They have shelter. They have a shelter. It's called a safe house. And it's mostly for women and children, but men are also taken care of. Men would be put up at a hotel, a safe hotel.
Okay. If the males are the victims of domestic violence,
yes,
is what you're saying.
If the males go and want to not be in the house.
Mhm. So, and I think that's important to understand that domestic violence is not only, just geared towards only women, although women are usually most of the victims are women, but it's not gender specific because victims can also be males as well. So, and the
Definitely,
perpetrators can be male or female.
definitely.
When you talk about domestic violence in your outreach to bring awareness, what is it that you say that you feel is the most important thing that you want to let your audience know about domestic violence?
There are several things that I talk about. First thing would be to define domestic violence, the different types of abuses that we have, because a lot of us think that it's just physical. Domestic violence is just physical, but it's not. So you have psychological or emotional, when you play with your feelings. You have sexual, and sexual abuse is not just rape. A lot of people think that it's just rape. No. Somebody showing you their body parts, somebody touching you inappropriately, all of that is sexual abuse. Then we have digital abuse, using your phone, using electronics to abuse you.
Give me an example of that.
For example, taking my phone, going through my phone, asking me who's calling me, checking to see who's calling me, whom I'm calling, breaking into my social media account.
Is that some sort of an invasion? Is that somehow akin to stalking?
Stalking is a behavior that would make anybody, any reasonable person, afraid. For example, everywhere you go, that person is there. For example, that person sending you gifts, leaving gifts at your door, sending you letters. That person breaking into your computer and they're being able to see everything that you do is mirrored on their computer. And stalking, stalking happens in domestic violence, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, because somebody could just take a shine to me and exhibit all of those behaviors. Stalking, we don't take stalking seriously, but stalking is so serious because stalking can end up in death.
Right. It is a form of domestic violence because it is an offense, it is a criminal offense. But have you seen connections with further violence or physical violence as connected to stalking?
It could branch out into that, into physical or emotional. Now, think about emotional. Somebody, you don't know where they're coming from. You keep getting phone calls, you keep getting texts, you keep getting DMs from that person. Don't you think that's going to scare you? Yes, it is.
And so that is the fear and the threatening type thing is what you're talking about with respect to the domestic violence.
Yes.
When you go out and you do your education, which DVSAC, I know that is the means of eradicating or in that fight against domestic violence is education. How do you, strategize how you speak and what you talk about in order to have that kind of impact that you want to get?
I like to have a conversation. We might do a quiz. We might start out with a quiz. I like hands-on. I like to talk to people and make sure that people understand what it is I'm talking about. Make sure that if anybody has any questions or something that has been nagging them for a while, they can ask me and that I can find an answer for them.
How impactful have you found when you speak to persons, especially with schools? You said that you speak a lot to the young people in the schools. How impactful have you found that has been with respect to their awareness?
Sometimes I'm amazed that they even remember. They remember me. So if they remember me, that means at least I made I did something. And I have had a couple of children actually tell me what's been going on with them, how they've been molested. And that is it's hard. It's really hard. I mean, I've cried long tears right there in the classroom because of the children's stories.
Do you do anything or take any action?
Well, I'm supposed to be a mandatory reporter, so I would report it.
And why do you see that reporting as being so important?
Because that's a way of helping the children. Imagine you're a child and you've been molested or you've been abused, and you tell your parents, because that is what I tell them to do. Tell your parents, tell a responsible adult. And you tell somebody and nothing happens. You know, you have to go back to that same situation and take the same kind of behavior continues. So that impacts a child. So I try my hardest to, when they tell me, follow through.
What about adult victims? And do you speak with them? And also, are you involved in educating them as well? And then what has the impact been?
It's a little harder. We set up workshops and we invite members of the public, and too many people don't show up. So we need the public to be proactive. When you hear something is being done, there's a workshop, there's some kind of conference, come on. You're educating yourself. You can help yourself if you're in that situation. Majority of us know somebody who's in an abusive situation. You can help them. They might not leave the situation, but at least they know that there are options. You know, you talk to them, tell them what the options are to stay in, and they know it. When they're ready, they'll do what they have to do.
So when you do have these public forums, whether people show up or not, or even just if one or two people show up, what kinds of things do you tell them then? What are you talking about?
We're talking about the prevalence of domestic violence. We describe domestic violence. We talk about the measures that one can take: a restraining order, going to the shelter, just talk about it. Don't keep it all bottled down inside.
But how do you empower other people to be a part of helping victims or being a part of that solution or of that fight against domestic violence? What do you tell them?
We tell them how, don't get upset if you talk to somebody and they don't pay you attention, they go back to that situation. Don't be upset if they leave and then they go back. There are reasons for that.
And what are some of the reasons that you are aware of that causes, and that this is an issue that people wonder about, why do they stay? And so what have you found as far as why they stay?
Okay. Nobody stays because they like getting beaten. A lot of us say, oh, they stay because they like it. That is not true. A person could have been threatened, either them or their children. A person has been isolated, because that is one thing abusers do. They isolate you from your friends, from your family, and you want to leave, but where am I going to go? I have no money. What am I going to do? Because of their culture, this till death do us part kind of thing, for better or for worse kind of thing. Some people really believe that the Bible says you stay no matter what. The Bible doesn't say to stay if you're being abused. It does not condone abuse. Excessive abuse, no. Maybe I'm here and I'm I'm living with the person, and the first thing they did is to take my papers, my passport, my work permit.
So that's a threat of deportation.
There
which
you
becomes
go.
Very real.
Very, very real. I have your papers. If you don't do what I say, I'll call the police, they'll deport you. That is the biggest lie. The police has nothing to do with that. So if you're in such a situation, do not believe your abuser. Call the police.
There is a system, yes, under the federal government where you can get a visa. There's certain types of visas specifically for domestic violence victims, so that they don't have to fear being deported just because they're reporting that.
Right.
So that is something that after the report, a lot of the victim advocate agencies assist with that, where you're protected in those circumstances.
Some people, they just plain old love that person they're with, and they really believe he or she is going to change. So you just stay, and you want to help them. You don't want to leave them alone because they're going to change.
So 2 things I'm going to ask you. Why is that not a good idea? And to do that, to stay? And second, why should other people care when it seems like they still want to stay?
There's something called the cycle of violence, where it starts with the tension growing. The victim has to be so careful. They walk on eggshells because any minute that explosion might happen. And then the explosion happens and the abuse takes place. And then, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that. But it's because you do this and because you do that. That is why I have to correct you. And so we have the apology. And then we have the honeymoon.
Honeymoon period.
Yes, we have the honeymoon. Everything is perfect. Best love you get in your life. But then what happens? We go back to the tension building. It's a cycle. Tension building. Eventually, the honeymoon period disappears. And we don't have time for that.
And it starts again.
So and then it starts again. So what might end up? Your life is at stake. Seriously, your life, your children's lives, they're at stake. So that is one reason why that is not a good reason to stay with an abuser. We should care because there is a reason why that person stays. Like I said, it could be their life. It could be their children's lives. So we should never, ever give up on victims. Never. Because they know why they're staying. And they could have a very valid reason. We don't know. But we just want to talk to them. We need to continue talking to them. Yes, we're mad, but think about the person. Forget about yourself. Think about the person. We've had examples right here on St. Thomas of people who left, and what happened to them? The abuser killed them. They left the situation and they got the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship is when the victim is leaving. Because think about it. I'm accustomed of beating up on you. You're gone. What am I going to do? I don't have anybody to beat up on anymore. So that's the most dangerous time. That's why they have to plan it. I think sometimes, depending on how abusive the situation is, leave the island, go someplace else. Family Resource Center can help you do that.
And the Women's Coalition as
well. And
the
Women's Coalition, yes.
So there can be a way of, are you saying, because what you're saying is that that's oftentimes the most dangerous part. So it's important to leave, but then it's a matter of getting the help you need to be able to protect your safety.
Yes, you have to definitely plan leaving. There are times you can stay right here, but sometimes the relationship is so very abusive, and that person has already told you, if I can't have you, nobody can have you. If you leave me, I will kill you. don't think they're playing. Don't think they're playing. They're serious. So if you can get away from the island, that's the best thing. And when you go away, don't call them. Don't call them. You do not want that person to know where you are.
What about then, let's say, people in the community? What can we do? Are people in the community generally, how are we empowered?
You hear somebody getting beaten, you see somebody getting beaten, pick up the phone, call 911. Please don't get involved, because that could be your life. But what do? You pick up the phone, you call 911. You talk to that. If you can talk to that person, go ahead and talk to them. We have tons of information. If you need information, hey, call me. My phone number on St. Thomas is 340-774-0144. On St. Croix, it's 340-719-0144. And that is the Virgin Islands Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Council. Family Resource Center, the number 340-776-STOP. 340-776-STOP. On St. Croix, Women's Coalition is 340-773-9272. And don't forget 911.
That should be in an emergency, particularly, that's the first thing that you call 911.
Yes.
And I know that the police department actually has specific persons and specific protocols in the response to domestic violence.
Yes.
That, outlined by the law as well as their policies, and they are required to respond to those types of emergencies.
Yes,
so that's
they do.
good.
Yes, they do.
So what would be the one last thing in closing that you want to let people know about domestic violence, as far as the awareness and the prevention and that mission of DVSAC?
Domestic violence is alive in our community. We need to talk about it. If you hear somebody being abused, please be a good neighbor. Be a nosy neighbor and call 911. If you know somebody who's being abused, please don't keep it a secret. I'm not talking about talking the person's business now. No, you don't do that. But talk to the person. You have information. Like I say, we have a lot of information. You can come and get information and give it to them. We have these little ones you can just stick in your pocket.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jean Baptiste, for this information today. Or I should say Jeanette. That's right. You told me to call you Jeanette. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us on Justice Matters.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all so much for joining us. And make sure to tune in to the next episode of Justice Matters.